In the room? Brilliant. Good afternoon, everyone, in the room and online. It's a real pleasure to welcome you all, and I know that there are people joining us from all around the world online, and it's great to have you here. My name is Dora Meredith, and I'm the Director of ODI Europe, which is a global affairs think tank here in Brussels, focused on bringing global evidence and dialogue to the European debate and part of the ODI Global Network. We're really delighted to be hosting this event today on the hidden cost of tariffs and how inclusive trade drives competitiveness. Today's event forms part of a series of events that we host here with UN Women called the Gender Talks, which are addressing the urgent challenges regarding gender and equality on many different topics, and we hold them every quarter. Today is actually the 7th edition. And we're really happy to be working in collaboration with our colleagues at UN Women on this event. Just before we start, for those in the room, just a reminder that we will be taking pictures, so please let us know if you're not happy to be included in them. The event will be recorded and posted on the ODI Europe event webpage. But first, I'd like to pass on to Brunella Canu from UN Women, who's going to provide some opening remarks. So, Brunella, over to you.
Thank you, Dora. It's a pleasure to be here. Good afternoon. And I don't know who is connected somewhere else in the world. Good morning. And so a warm welcome to all of you here in the room and online. And it's a pleasure to represent UN Women. And I really I take the opportunity to thank ODI Europe for this amazing collaboration. So today's topic is the hidden cost of tariffs, how inclusive trade drives competitiveness. That's an interesting topic. And when we talk about trade, economics, competitiveness, what do you think? The first thing you think is not really inclusion or gender, right? So that's why this type of events are so needed at this point. So now I'm going to stick with my talking points because we are a bit late. So when we think about that, we think about numbers and trends, which are a bit detached sometimes from people's reality, right? So behind every statistic, we should remind that there are women and men whose livelihood, opportunities, and choices are shaped by these policies. So as you may see in the news, as unfortunately, today we live in a world marked by growing geopolitical tensions, tariff escalations, economic shocks, and we should remind ourselves that trade is never gender neutral, as any other crisis. So when markets contract, supply chain shift, or tariff rise, women are often the first to feel the impact. We've seen that also with climate change impact. So especially those working in labor-intensive sectors such as textile, garment, and small-scale agriculture. So now I'm just touching up on some of key points generally, and then our panelists will discuss in more details on that. Women continue to face barriers that limit their participation and the full potential, such as unequal access to finance and technology, unequal share of unpaid care responsibilities, limited training opportunities, and discriminatory social norms that hold them back. Particularly if we think about when these things intersect with other factors, such as disability. Trade cuts across every aspect of our economies. We cannot think about any sector that is outside of international trade, right? So, and that's why we must address these challenges at all levels, including here in the EU. So inclusive trade policy isn't just a question of fairness, but it's a matter of smart economics. We always say that at UN Women, but also ODI Europe in many other events that we organize together. So we also know that we cannot do that without women, right? We have made some progress. For example, the Addis Ababa Action Agenda 2015 to recognize women as producers, traders, and key agents for development. Yet almost 10 years later, women remain underrepresented in international trade, often confined to informal and non-tradable sectors, like trade, education, social services. And in these sectors, unfortunately, sometimes these are what low pay. There's little social protection, so we should address that. And these are part of the systemic barriers, from unequal access to finance and markets to discriminatory social norms. So trade and economic policies can either reinforce these challenges or can address these inequalities. So tariffs can raise prices on goods that women rely on most, while reduction in tariffs may lower government revenues, resulting in cuts to social services or worsening labor standards. In some cases, trade liberalization triggers a race to the bottom in wages and working conditions. We have several examples in research, but I'll let the experts speak about that. So we also need better data. We usually say that better data, quality-based data, and quantitative, but also qualitative data. Stronger evidence and more gender-responsive trade policy making. We must understand how trade structures, tariffs, and shocks affect women as individuals, but also as entrepreneurs, workers, and consumers, and ensure that trade becomes a force for inclusion and not exclusion. So we would like to use this opportunity today to discuss how we can make trade work for women and with women, and how we can design policies that not only protect, but also empower women. So we're looking forward to hearing from our panelists today. And now enjoy the event, and I will hand it over back to Dora. Thank you.
Thank you, that's great. And it gives me great pleasure now to hand over to our moderator, Dr. Prachi Agarwal, who will be moderating the session. Prachi is a research fellow in the International Economic Development Group at ODI Global. She's worked extensively on analysis of trade policy, regional trade agreements and digital trade. And she leads the research at ODI Global on women in trade, aiming at improving gender equality of trade policy. So Prachi, thank you so much for being here, and I hand over to you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Dora. It's a pleasure to actually welcome you on behalf of ODI Europe and UN Women to this panel discussion today. As Dora mentioned, I am Prachi Agarwal, a research fellow at ODI Global, based in London. And at the moment, I'm a one-woman army who's been leading the work on women in trade at ODI. And I'm very pleased to be here because I'm so glad to see that there's so much interest on this topic. And I never thought that when I started working on it, I never thought that it's actually going to get out there and we're going to end up doing something like this. So such an excellent gathering online and in person who care about women empowerment and gender equality. So I want to take this opportunity to also thank Dora and the entire team at ODI Europe for being so welcoming and doing an excellent job of representing the ODI family here in the EU and the philosophy that we carry as ODI. Today's conversation actually comes at a moment of really extraordinary turbulence in the global world. Trade wars have reignited, there were shifting alliances, there's rising protectionism and new vulnerabilities for businesses and workers everywhere. So while tariff schedules and retaliatory measures have dominated the headlines these days, I mean, we all know about that, the human stories really don't come out that much. So half the world's population, which are women, experience these trade shocks very, very differently. And this difference matters profoundly, not just for countries' competitiveness or the industry's competitiveness, but also resilience as to how do we react to shocks, all kinds of different shocks. So just a bit of background on what we're going to do today. The last decade has seen trade become deeply politicized. From the first wave of the US-China tariffs back in 2018 to the renewed measures of the new Trump's reciprocal tariffs, firms everywhere, firms globally have felt a squeeze through disrupted supply chains, higher input costs, and this new algebra of competitiveness. How do we continue making a difference? How do we remain afloat while we are facing all of the different things. And I think gender plays a very big part in it. These macroeconomic tensions have, however, concealed a very large structural blind spot, which is all of these different trade policies or different shocks have a gendered impact. And as recent research at ODI Global has shown that seemingly very neutral tariffs can have unequal consequences. So products predominantly used or produced by women, for example, um, attract a higher tariff than other goods that are consumed by both men and women. So if you see examples of sanitary products, makeup, women's clothing, shoes, footwear, handbags, everything that is consumed by women have attract a higher tariff. And so when women actually end up buying these goods when they go to the market and buy these goods, they are paying a higher price than men for the exact same goods. So we saw this in the case of the US and then extended that analysis to see that this is actually a regular occurrence in most countries. All over the EU, UK, where I'm based, every country has a significant difference in what is being applied on women's goods versus general consumer goods. And this disparity was actually absolutely shocking for me that we don't realize that within the very structure of the policy of each country, there's an inherent difference, and we're just not looking close enough, basically. That's the problem. So this is what we call pink tariffs, and these illustrate how economic measures presented as gender neutral are usually not gender neutral. They not only produce inequalities, but they also exacerbate the existing structural inequalities. Similarly, on the supply side, as was already mentioned, women face a multitude of barriers when even, like, for example, with their access to finance, access to information about where to trade, how to do business. Their economic activity is their participation in economic activity is highly squeezed because of that. And this destabilizes sectors that are predominantly employ women or have women-led businesses. So the ripple effect, even across the labor market, is intense. And I'm running through these different channels so that anybody who's here who has a little bit of understanding about these different things will be able to appreciate the conversation we're about to have and understand that gender in trade policy is not really about trade policy. It's about everything that you're doing. Everything you look at is being impacted by these gendered effects of trade policy. So, for example, in labor-intensive sectors where women are predominantly employed, such as the textiles and garment sector or footwear sector, women make up about 70% of the global workforce. And when the US tariffs, for example, came into being, and now the expiry of the AGOA, which is the Africa Growth Opportunity Act, just background, AGOA was essentially an agreement which gave several African countries tariff-free entry into the US market for many goods. And one of them was the textiles and garment sector. And when the AGOA expired on 30th of September and the Trump tariffs came into being simultaneously, it led to massive factory closures all over Africa. Factory closures, women who were employed in low wage and low skilled jobs in these factories were the first to be let off. And what's even interesting, to humanize this even further, these women were the sole bread earners of families of about 4 to 5 individuals. And the moment they lose their jobs or they don't get wages, it essentially means you have lower access to healthcare. You don't know whether you're going to have the next meal on your table, so that's a higher incidence of food insecurity. Children get pulled out of school at an early age, so it's basically impacting in the entire social fabric of where these factories are based. And most of these factories came up because of these preferences to the US market. So the moment they were pulled out, it was literally like pulling a rug from under their feet. And now there's massive immigration that's happening, where women are now trying to move with their entire families looking for jobs. And there aren't really any jobs, especially with their skill set. So I don't want to take too much time because this is a bit of a grim story. I'm really sorry to bum everybody out this afternoon. It's a bit of a grim story, and however, it's not just a social tragedy, it's also an economic one. Governments, from the macroeconomic perspective, governments are losing tax revenues and foreign exchange because they can't export anymore. The demand for public services and public support has been rising, which essentially means that fiscal space is tightening even further. And when women's incomes collapse, we just saw that the total demand in the economy goes down, and it essentially means you're feeding a cycle of slower growth and deeper inequality. So this actually is the hidden cost of tariffs, all of this, measured not only in trade balances, but also in loss in human capital and long-term competitiveness. So today we have an opportunity to rethink trade policy in a way that has inclusion and competitiveness at its core. They are not two things that are competing with each other. Economic growth should not be competing with economic equality or social equality. What we don't understand, and this is what Dora also said, that what we don't see is that women form 50% of our population. So if we are leaving them behind, we are losing out a lot, even economically. And I don't think policymakers think that way. And we're going to find out about that on our panel. And I want to quickly invite the panel to the stage now. So first, I think Simonetta is online. So quickly to her, if you can turn on your camera. Simonetta Zarili is a leading trade analyst with over 30 years of experience in the United Nations system. Her work has focused on policy analysis, capacity building, and international dialogue on trade and development. Am I? Okay. Simonetta is currently an advisor at ArtNet and a founding member of the WTO Gender Research Hub. Thank you for joining us, Simonetta. I'm just going to introduce the other panelists and then we can begin shortly. Belen Gracia is a PhD candidate. Belen, please do come on. Is a PhD candidate at Maastricht University Faculty of Law. Her research explores the intersection between international law and an inclusive circular economy in plastics. She had had 10 years of professional experience as an international lawyer, and she was the director of trade policy with Mercosur in Aladi at the Argentine National Ministry of Production and a trade negotiator for the government of Argentina for many years. Next we have Victor Slor, sorry, I'm going to butcher your name in advance. Stolzenberg is a research economist in the Economic Research and Statistics Division of the World Trade Organization. His work examines the intersection of international trade and development, and he leads research for global value chains, and he has been an author of several policy reports in value chains with aspects of inclusiveness and resilience. And finally, Cornelio Eftodi brings over 20 years of professional experience working for the United Nations and the World Bank, with leadership responsibilities in programming for gender equality and social development. Until 2023, he served as deputy representative with the UN Women Multi-Country Office in the Pacific region, where he steered committees on women's economic empowerment, ending violence against women and girls, women in governance, and women in disaster risk management. Disaster risk reduction. So we have a very interesting and highly motivated panel today who would kick this conversation off, and I'm just going to take my seat and see you on there. Trying to use the table. Hello? Okay. May we please have a quick round of applause, please, for the speakers. All right, I'm going to start online with Simonetta because she brings a wealth of experience in terms of trying to understand how trade policy impacts gender equality. And so Simonetta, are you there?
I am here.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much. Yes, so my first question to you actually, that in many export oriented and labor intensive economies, large number of women work in sectors such as textiles, apparel, and manufacturing. And how do you think governments can respond to the gendered impact of trade policy or trade shocks that we see today, including tariffs, shifting trade preferences, and supply chain disruptions?
Hey, thank you, and thank you for the question. Thank you very much for inviting me. I am actually on a holiday in Sicily, and this is why I was not able to join you in Brussels. But thank you for providing me with the opportunity to participate online. So I would like to follow up on what your very interesting and thought-provoking introduction. And regarding countries, developing countries, but especially countries which are included in the list of the least developed countries, so the 44 countries that according to UN classification are the most vulnerable from an economic and environmental point of view. So what is happening, what is a bit in a nutshell the situation of these countries before what we can call the trade war? Let's take some example. You already mentioned, I think, Lesotho. In Lesotho, 3/4 of the production of textile and clothing, especially clothing, is as a destination, the United States. And this export to the United States account for around 20% of Lesotho GDP. And regarding the workforce in this sector, 80% are women. In the case of moving to another continent, in the case of Cambodia, textile, garment, footwear, and travel goods made up a bit less than 60% of Cambodia exports. These are data from 2022. And export to the US contributed a quarter to Cambodia GDP. And again, 80% of the labor force in this sector is made out of women. Another example, Vietnam. 30% of Vietnam's GDP comes from export to the US. And 75% of the workforce in the textile sector is represented by women. What I would like to say with this data is that for those countries, export of textile, clothing, footwear, travel goods represent a very significant part of their export, and they make a very significant contribution to their GDP. So their economy is very much dependent on the production and the export of these goods to the United States market. Now, if we look at the other side, what do these exports represent for the import represent for the United States? Negligible. All these exports are negligible if you look at the US GDP. So this idea that high tariffs should be put to rebalance trade deficit for the United States, it really doesn't work very well in this case, because we are talking about small economies exporting exports which are very important for them, but are negligible for the United States. So there is something that in this case, the logic of this rebalancing doesn't now, as you already mentioned, women are being dismissed. And for instance, in the case of Lesotho, declared a national state of disaster because of the collapse of the clothing industry. And as you also very rightly mentioned, when women are dismissed, there are very immediate and very bad impact on the family in terms of health, education, and food. Something else we may expect, that is production shifting to countries which can still enjoy some more favorable tariff treatment. And we know that this is not new. For instance, when the multi-fiber agreements reached an end, production shifted, for instance, from Central American countries to Africa. Now, why are women so badly affected? This is because even in those countries where they represent the large majority of workers, they still have a kind of unstable part-time jobs that don't imply career development, don't provide stability, don't provide good salaries. And when shocks come, these are the kind of workers that immediately are laid off. And we know that this is not happening for the first time, is exactly what it happened during the pandemic, where women, because of this precarious employment status, were the first ones to lose their jobs. Now, what are countries doing? I think most countries, not only those countries I have been talking about, the least developed countries or other developing countries, all countries are trying to find alternative markets to the United States market. But this is not easy, and this is not happening overnight, because if many countries at the same time are looking for alternative markets, there is a fierce competition among them. So it is something that is quite challenging. And another thing is to move to other sectors, so to having less concentration of production and export in specific sectors like the textile and clothing sector. But also this is a process that may take time, and is a process that may be particularly challenging for women. We know the kind of shortcomings in education, in technological literacy, in digital literacy, and also the poverty, the time poverty that makes for women difficult to find enough time to upgrade their knowledge. So an alternative, something that makes sense and countries are exploring, is in this search of diversifying their export market, is to use regional integrations. So to make more use of the regional agreements they have among themselves. And for instance, in the case of Africa, the African the African regional, the new regional integration among provide trade among themselves instead of being so dependent from foreign markets, and especially from the United States market. My last point is on this issue is that we have also to think that these tariffs, the so-called trade war, is in a way exacerbating problems that already exist in the countries. Because if we have women concentrated in a very small number of sectors, if the kind of job they have are precarious, low paid, no career opportunities jobs, this is something that depends on the countries. So in a way, the tariffs, like in the past, the pandemic, have magnified the problems that already existed. And these are problems that the countries should try to address through national policies, for instance, policies of upskilling women, allowing them to have the skills, the competencies to move to other sectors that may be less affected by tariffs, and or put in place some networks that can social networks that can support them in the caution in the moment where they lose their jobs and they don't have immediate employment opportunity. And this is something that many countries did and did quite successfully after the pandemic. So I will stop here. Thank you.
The US market, and this is the case for many countries. And however, I think what sort of I'm perplexed with is the fact that when government administrations are dealing or talking about these changes in trade policy, are they thinking about this impact? And I think that's the important question. So that's my question to you, Belen. From your experience as being a trade negotiator, do countries or governments actually think about women while they're negotiating? And are these negotiators actually aware of the gender impact their policies or trade agreements could have? So, what have you learned so far?
Thank you very much. Do you hear me? This one?
Yeah.
Good. There?
Yep.
Yes? Perfect. First, thank you very much for the invitation to ODI Europe and UN Women. It's a pleasure to be here in Brussels today with you. And thank you for the question. It's a difficult question. And I was thinking about this while I was coming here, and I thought, well, maybe we can even go beyond and ask ourselves, do countries actually think about inclusion when they are negotiating trade agreements, actually? And this is something that interests me in the context of my work as an academic at Maastricht University, and particularly in the context of multilateral negotiations, because when we think about inclusion, we can think from two perspectives mainly. One perspective, which is the substantive perspective, like what are the provisions that are actually included in the agreement, right? But also from procedural or participatory perspective. And this has two points, let's say. One is who are the ones, or who are the people, who are the groups that are being, on the one hand, consulted, and also, so previously and during negotiations, and also who are the groups that are actually participating in the implementation of the agreement later on, and what does the agreement actually provides in terms of how is it going to be implemented? How are the provisions are going to be monitored and later on actually enforced, right? And in terms of the participatory part, for example, when we think about consultation, we have to take into account, in particular, also the level of development of countries. Which countries are we actually thinking when we say, do countries consider inclusion, or do countries consider gender issues when they are negotiated? Because the reality is that certain countries, when they start negotiating trade agreements, for example, they didn't used to have procedures in place to actually consult their populations. And this was also true from some countries in Latin America, which is the region I come from. The question that is also interested for me in this context is, then can we actually think of a responsibility on the part of the counterpart? If there are no procedures in place in the country you are negotiating a trade agreement with, does the counterpart actually has a responsibility to ensure that that consultation process actually takes place, and that different situations and groups are considered when alongside the consultation process? So it is very important to recognize that trade agreements and trade in particular, trade policy in general, actually, not only trade agreements, but trade policy in general, affect men and women differently, but also trade agreements can affect different women differently. So what we often see is in the context specifically of impact assessments of trade agreements, for example, is a recommendation that we need a gender-based analysis approach, right? But a gender-based analysis approach is not enough if it is not accompanied by the intersectionality approach. And when we think about intersectionality, we have to consider, for example, the issue that there are multiple grounds of discrimination that can actually compound disadvantage, right? And this translate into different needs for different women, taking into account social class, taking into account race, taking into account age, indigenous populations, disabilities. And if all these differences are not taken or are not considered in this gender-based approach, we are actually also missing out on the particularities of the differences that we can find among these wide group of considered to be women, right? And precisely because of these differences, is it important, I consider that it's important to talk about inclusion, because we need to embrace these differences and recognize these differences and not invisibilize them. There's actually a colleague and a scholar from New Zealand, Carrie Stoddard-Sim, that is doing great work about the invisibilization of Indigenous women in relation to trade, that I invite you to take a look at, because it's precisely points to this issue of not invisibilizing certain voices of women in trade. And this goes hand by hand with participation, because it is not enough to have this woman on the table, but it is also something that countries need to take into account when negotiating trade agreements. How are these groups actually be later on involved in the implementation of the agreement? And I think to briefly address, and we can also talk later, the challenge part of your question, which is like what kind of obstacles, right, do we face when negotiating trade agreements? I think we can mainly identify three. One, I already addressed, the participation part, which are the groups that are actually consulted and later on taken into account in the implementation of the agreement. The other issue is data. And this is something that was already mentioned in the introduction, but data in particular in developing countries, there's a lack of statistics that discriminates certain things regarding trade, in particularly when we look at the gender aspects. In the services sector, maybe you can say more about this, Victor, but this is actually a huge challenge in the services sectors as well when we talk about statistics. And the third issue that I thought is very interesting is the issue of trust. Especially when we have negotiations between trade negotiations between developed countries and developing countries. Why? Well, mainly because when we try to address the issue of trade and sustainable development, which usually will include aspects related to gender equality, but also other aspects like environment, protection of the environment, or labor rights, human rights in general, there is a distrust sometimes from developing countries that these type of provisions are going to be included in the agreement with a hidden motivation, let's say, and to hide protectionist interest from the developed country. And this is unfortunate for sure, but it's a reality, and sometimes is unfortunate also motivated or let's say generated by the unilateral measures that some countries have and some blocs have taken recently regarding this type of issues, that creates this distrust environment in the developing world. And I think this is also directly correlated to the lack of action in the multilateral environment. And this also goes to the WTO. And actually the call for the need to address this type of issues at the multilateral level and not so much at the bilateral level. I will stop here and looking forward to the rest of the conversation.
Thank you, Belen. I think you highlight very interesting things, and the three issues that you have very rightly pointed out that are some of these obstacles negotiators face, trade negotiators face when they're trying to embed gender and inclusion clauses in agreements. Of course, the role of WTO and other multilateral organizations increases in such, in such issues, and especially the geopolitical tensions we are facing today. It has become highly important to understand that and even propagate the idea that having gender inclusion within trade is not really a luxury. It should not be considered a luxury. It's a bare minimum. And on that, Victor, what are your views on that exact thing, that rising geopolitical tensions with them, how do you ensure that gender equality is not perceived as a luxury, but is now seen central to resilience in trade policy?
Thank you, Prachi, and also thank you to ODI and UN Women for inviting me. And before I begin, I need to make the housekeeping item that I do not speak on behalf of the membership, but I'm here in my personal capacity, which is also good because it means I can't be held responsible for your reactions of the membership. But to get to your question, yes, it's definitely true. Right now, what we see is that there's a removal of support and funding from this issue, from the trade and women work, and more broadly, right? There's a reduction in funding to health, to humanitarian affairs, human rights, which you all pointed out before. There's a particular burden on women, and that is a problem. But let me maybe give you two reasons why we can be slightly optimistic, nevertheless, in this regard. So firstly, while there's an emergence of new priorities, that doesn't mean that, at least within the WTO, we see a broad-based turn away from trade and gender as such. The informal working group on trade and women remains very active at the WTO, and there's a lot of dynamism still in terms of trying to tackle this and push this forward. So the fact that new priorities do emerge, which partly is also understandable given the geopolitical context, for instance, with the land war in Europe. That doesn't mean that a lot of the membership is not still very supportive of this issue. The fact that there's a turn away from that support is being taken away from the working group on trade and gender is very limited to a very small. It's very confined to a small set of members. And in this regard, let me come to my second point, and let me take a little detour here, based on a study we recently released. Because what we've done for that study is we took the pink tariff work we've done with the World Bank in 2020 on the production side, because you talked about the pink tariffs on the consumption side, but of course we have the same issue on the production side, that sectors that employ more women face larger tariffs when they try to export. So market access for female-intensive sectors tends to be lower. So we've extended this work by looking at or by estimating trade costs in the services sector, because of course a huge problem is that you cannot observe trade costs in service directly. You need to estimate them, which is a lot harder than to look at tariffs. So we've done this work, and what we then did next is we used an economic model to estimate what happens if we get rid of the gender bias, first in trade cost and tariffs, and then second in trade costs more broadly. And interestingly, when we took out the gender bias in tariffs, there was nearly no effect on the gender wage gap. And there are two reasons for this. The first reason is that as inefficient as a policy tool tariffs are, they still provide some protection to domestic employment. So high tariffs obviously mean less market access to the exporting of goods, but they also protect employment in the importing economy. And the reduction of tariffs in these sectors actually, they led to a slightly lower gender wage gap in some economies, but typically at the expense of a decrease of an increase in other economies. But actually, what was the even more important channel is that, as you pointed out before, the majority of female employment is, with a few exceptions, in no economy within manufacturing, but that's where the tariffs are. Then a lowering of tariffs means an expansion of the manufacturing sector at the expense of the services and agricultural sector, right? And because they tend to be even more or relatively more female intensive, it means that demand for female employment actually goes down in relative terms. So we have this. I mean, this is not to say that in some economies such as Lesotho or Cambodia you might have a different story, but these are really exceptions. So. And that was very much backed up when we then exactly did the second simulation. We lowered trade costs in the services sector, and then we had a much larger response of the gender wage gap. So the gender wage gap went down by almost 1 percentage point, which the baseline is 21, which is quite remarkable for a trade shock, because I mean there are many reasons as to why we have a gender wage gap. So it's not just about trade. So the fact that a trade reform can lead to such a big impact is quite remarkable, especially because these models sometimes give relatively small effects. Second of all, we got an even larger impact when we increased the tradability of some services in particular. And so we tried to simulate a digitalization shock where health and education in particular become more tradable. And that by far had the largest impact in decreasing the gender wage gap. And to link this back to your original question, I think obviously, it's not good that we have a trade war, but insofar as there is this weird obsession with manufacturing within the economy that started the trade war, I think that's at least not the worst sector to focus on from a gender equality perspective, because essentially it leaves the sector out of the conflict that is where female employment is the highest.
Thank you. I have so many questions, but I'm going to stop myself and perhaps use this privilege later to ask you some things about what you did for the services sector. But I want to move on to Cornelio and just understand that I think you've been responsible for designing or implementing such policies, inclusive trade policies, or at least advising on how to do inclusive trade policy. And do you think this has actually translated into real women's economic empowerment in countries? Do you have any examples that you can share with us?
Thank you very much. I liked your introduction at the beginning when you said about it's not only about tariffs, it's about everything else that that is part of this trade ecosystem. And I wanted to even zoom out even further and to say, actually, if we look at this, it's part of people's lives, right? Trade. So when we talk about the barriers, it's all of those, discrepancies and gender discrepancies that are based on the social construct, right? We just launched a study this morning in this very room on gender equality and just transition, focusing on jobs, because when you trade services and goods. So there is someone that needs to develop to produce those services and goods to be traded. So I think that's the major question to ask ourselves, who are those people? Because we talk about inclusivity, so people's focused interventions. So if you zoom it even out in that respect, and we looked at the services and we looked at the agriculture and we looked at the manufacturing. And if you look about the green jobs now, because the context is important, right? And everyone is moving towards decarbonized economies and the green jobs, then women are only 1 in 3 out of every green jobs, and the other 2/3 are men. So they're already like in a minority there. And one might say, well, if you do nothing in this process, then you'll have the same discrepancy. Well, actually, what the study shows, actually, if you don't invest for targeted gender equality results, the difference is even widening. Why? Because transfer from the brown jobs to the green jobs for women is twice as more difficult as for men because of the skill set that is there, right? But also because of the wages. Because you talk about the gender pay gap, and you mentioned we talk about the 21%. So that is actually at risk of even being bigger. In terms of UNDP, we focus a lot on inclusive trade policies and programming. So we've done that in Central Asia, in this region, in Africa. There is a big work around this. We looked at what are the barriers we really face around trade, and obviously there are tariffs, but there's a lot of non-tariff barriers, as you mentioned. The study, which I think was done jointly by UNDP and UN Women in Africa, showed that between 60 and 85% of women are not even aware of the benefits that some tariff regimes can bring to them as individual or companies. So we go back to the issue of is a participation. I would even say leadership. Are we even having gender equality in the leadership positions to be able to take those decisions, even to say, let's make sure everyone knows what the tariffs are about and how we can use. Access to finance, that's another one. In Central Asia, we're focusing a lot now, for example, on making sure that women know how to use the e-commerce platforms, right? Because we talk about now the moving trade to the digital platforms. But then there is, again, a risk that if we do not put gender equality front and center of these interventions, not like a mainstreaming one, we need to forget, I mean, not to forget about this word, but we need to move from this word mainstreaming into like very specific targeted actions. Then the gap will widen. I mean, there are studies that say that we need 300, 400 years at the current pace to achieve gender equality in economics. I think if we do nothing, the 400 years will not stay there. It will become 4,000 years because there is risk of basically reversing the progress, regressing in a way. So I think it's important when we do programming, and that's what we as UNDP do, is to make sure that we take into account these aspects. It's not only figures, it's looking at people who are actually inputting into this trade actions. And I think leadership is a big one, because leadership obviously is about participation, but it's about making, we didn't do that, but I would wonder, like, if we would do an analysis of what's the gender representation in the negotiating space, I think we would be surprised to see very low numbers, or maybe not surprised to see very, very low numbers, right? And then how can, we say if it's about me, then not without me, but then it's without me, without half of the population negotiating those agreements. In the intra-regional trade, I think it's a big topic now. It was mentioned as well. I mean, for example, in Central Asia, UNDP looks on it, basically says like we are overlooking a capacity in the region. So how can we actually support, trade between the countries in the same region? And then once you open up that space in terms of programming, because that is the question, then you need to take into account like who is there, who will take a decision, who will be designing this program. So I think these are crucial moments, and it's not only about accessing to those services and information. It's about leading the way in those designs, right? It's not about like, okay, we've got a design, let's ask women if it's okay. Different groups of women, I agree, but it's actually about working together to understand how to tailor that program. Care, a big one, right? I think care comes out for us as UNDP, comes out in every single area of work that we do. It just pops up. We launched a study on green and just transition and gender equality. care is popping up there. We're doing, we have an Equal Future platform working on the leadership for women. Care is popping up as an issue, right? I think, and when you look at care, obviously there is the 3 R's, and now lately it's the 5 R's, recognizing, redistributing, rewarding. I think it's also important to look at this as a redistribution of attention and resources, right? We don't talk only about additional, burden on the state or on the private sector to take on care. It's going back to this idea of social construct. Now we had a chat in between these 2 events that I'm participating with someone, and we talked about care responsibilities on an individual basis. And we came to say that it's not about like men helping women to take care. It's about, taking part, being engaged in care. And I think it's this redistribution should be at the individual and family level, but also vertically within the government, within the nations, right? How does the state want to redistribute this care on a fair basis so that, you can free up time to lead on trade? Yeah, so maybe I'll stop here because there's another thing that I wanted to share, but maybe if there's a second round of questions, I can.
No, you can continue because I was going to come to you.
Anyways.
Okay. Yeah, take 2 more minutes.
Okay.
Yeah, because we have one quick round after this before we open up to the panel, to the audience online and both here. But so 2 minutes for everybody, and I'll come to the next panelist after this. Yeah, go on.
Thank you very much. I think another important part that is related to trade, but to overall economic empowerment of women and women's economic empowerment, rather, I would say, is looking at the economic system in a country, right? So now it's not intra-regional trade or international trade, but even in the economic system, which is, based on the, on the very, masculinized beliefs of powers and whatnot. So as UNDP, we have developed this global program called Economics, basically challenging the economics thinking and the belief of the economists, right? So we embedded this in the trainings of the economists within the UNDP internally, right? So you cannot preach what you are not, if you're not changing the belief internally in your own family, so to say. So the economics look at changing this, right? This belief, and there is multiple streams of the work that the economics program does. Obviously, one is the fiscal space, where we want to look at how can we actually redistribute the resources in a country by revising the fiscal space, right? The policy around the taxation. And we've done some analytics around this, and it's amazing to see sometimes even the authorities are being surprised to see, oh wow, we didn't realize that is a discrepancy, right? Like in Kyrgyzstan, we've done a study not on the fiscal but related to the taxes paid by the companies from a certain sector to the state budget. And in certain sectors, women-owned companies are only 8% of the total share, but they pour 24% of the taxes. So I think that, we can open up a totally different discussion around why that is happening. But that's one stream, and then the other stream is obviously looking at the care one and challenging the standard economic beliefs, because I think they're not working anymore as they should. So the economics is one way of doing that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cornelia. I'm going to go in reverse order. So back to you, Victor. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about what do you think going forward is WTO's role in making sure inclusion is on the table always? I know it's a very hard task, but always on the table, one. And two, what is your one quick recommendation on how do countries make sure that they continue talking about this when they are negotiating trade agreements or even creating national trade policies? So quick 2 minutes or one each. Thank you.
I think I can be short by combining this to some extent, because I think what we need to do based on our research is to make sure that there's finally progress on some of these areas where we're lacking behind. It's on digital trades, on services trade, right, where at the multilateral level, at least, we are lacking way behind what has been agreed at a regional level or even applied to regimes at a unilateral level. So I think that is by far the most important thing that we need to achieve at the multilateral level, and somehow break this deadlock with the inclusion of the plurilaterals into the multilateral framework, given that at the plurilateral level we have much more progress on e-commerce and on services. So I think that's something we need to make progress on, because sometimes it's not the explicit gender provisions, but it's the implicit gender provisions that might, have the biggest impact on gender equality. Notwithstanding, of course, that then you need to do at the domestic level exactly what Cornelio has said before. You need to address the barriers that prevent people from actually making use of the agreements and the preferences that are being set.
Thanks. Bilin, back to you. Same question, similar question, but from your perspective as a negotiator, what advice can you give countries for future negotiations, how to keep gender inclusion on the table? And you already explained to us what kind of challenges you face, but I'm sure you have encountered those challenges, but also sort of won over those challenges. So maybe draw from that as to what did you do exactly and whether that can be replicated again.
Wow. Okay, I will try in 2 minutes. But I think, yeah, I think one of the things that we need to ask ourselves is having a chapter, for example, specifically on trade and gender. Is that what we are looking for in trade agreements, or do we actually want to see the issue of gender mainstreamed alongside the agreement, and not only one chapter in particular that, for example, has a more cooperative approach rather than substantive provisions that address the issue of trade and gender. And this is not to say that this type of chapters are not important, or that do not have symbolic importance, but also a practical relevance, in the sense that, for example, they can help to change the normative environment in a country, right? When you basically pave the way for a regulatory transformation in the country, that through the inclusion of this particular chapter in a trade agreement. But mainstreaming gender alongside the agreement actually look very differently. For example, if we take into account what we can do in the chapters of trade and rules of origin, for example, trading goods and rules of origin. This is something that we started to see in some agreements that Canada, for example, has ratified or has put forward. And in particular, it was something that during my time in the negotiations, also in the negotiations between Mercosur and Canada, it was something that was pushed for, the inclusion of particular rules of origin to simplify or to give like alternatives to qualified as originating certain goods as originated, right, in the context of the agreement, to give access to markets of products that were produced, for example, but women in traditional settings, or folkloric products, or indigenous handcrafts goods, for example. And this is something that can actually be achieved if we have a broader look of trying to mainstream, as I said, gender in the trade agreements, and not only include it in a particular chapter that addresses the issue more from a comparative perspective. But then if we go, for example, more at the, if we take a look, for example, at the implementation of the agreement, the possibility to have groups that monitor the implementation of the agreement and how those groups are composed goes to the point that you were making, actually, Cornelius, because in my experience, when we were trying to consult certain groups, for example, of women, of women entrepreneurs, or women that were trading in certain in certain sectors, particularly in small regional economies, we had to not only be aware of including these different groups, but also the responsibility of negotiators of trying to explain the potential effects that these rules would have in their markets and in their products or in their services that they were trying to trade. So I think there's, you said leadership, and I will say also responsibility of negotiators in educating their constituencies as well. When sometimes that's not a given in certain countries, that the people, the humans, as you said, the human element that are trading actually could have that knowledge of what is going to be the impacts in their businesses and in their services that they're trading.
I think that's really good advice. I only wish that more people were listening to you and to this panel right now, because I think we're coming up with really good suggestions on what can be done. Moving on to Simonetta, back to you, where we started. What can you add to this in terms of the same question again? And I want some quick wins. How do we get quick wins for gender inclusion and in trade policies and trade agreements? And what advice would you give governments trying to negotiate such things?
I think I would stress 3 points. One was already made, that is not only to have trade and gender chapters in the trade agreements, but to make sure that these chapters are well connected with the other chapters of the agreement, to avoid to have them as kind of isolated in the framework of the agreement, or to have other chapters that somehow dilute the significance of the gender chapter. Then I would suggest to make and from on this point, there are some FTAs that already, for instance, are linking the gender chapter with the chapter on digital trade. So underlying that digital trade can be an opportunity for women, but at the same time, there are barriers that should be recognized and addressed. The second point, I would encourage trade negotiators, policymakers to make the commitments included in the gender chapters mandatory, because what we have for the time being is a very soft language. So indeed, there are no obligations. Countries commit to cooperate, commit to share information, to share data, but at the end, if they don't do so, there are no strict there are no way to say, okay, you signed this agreement, but you are not doing what you mentioned you would do. So perhaps a stronger language, a language that implies a real commitment to facilitate women's participation in trade, and to have a quality participation, not only a quantity participation. The third point is about a clause that some agreements include, that is the non-derogation clause. The non-derogation clause means that countries agreed that they will not lower, for instance, labor standards to make to attract investment, or to become more competitive. And I think it's a very interesting development. For the time being, this clause, the no derogation clause, has been used especially for in relation to labor, so that you don't low down your standards just to become more competitive and more appealing for investment. But we have an example, that is the agreement, the FTA between the UK and Ukraine, that was signed just before the war. And in this agreement, the non-derogation clause regards also gender issues. So it means you are not you commit not to lower your gender equality legislation, the commitments that you have taken at a national level regarding gender equality, just to become more competitive. And this goes back to what we have discussed, that in many cases, providing low salaries and precarious jobs to women has been used as a tool to improve competitiveness. I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I think an interesting, very technical perspective, and I'm glad there was a technical perspective, at least for me, I'm a trade nerd. But I don't think many people in the audience are trade nerds, as am I. So, but I think I'm going to take that back very fondly and use that, and obviously attribute it to you, Simonetta. So I want to open the floor to some questions. In person here or online, please do raise your hand if you have a question for our panel. And we're going to hope that we are able to answer it.
Thank you. I'm Julia.
From the top.
I'm Julia, EU Works. Yes. I'm Julia. I'm working as a EU policy officer for European Parliamentary Forum for Sexual and Reproductive Rights. So reproductive rights in development policies. And I have several questions. First will be about, I'm curious about the issue of trust that you mentioned. Would you please bring several examples about protectionist interest for developed countries in the negotiations with developing countries, just to understand what does mean in practice, because for me, I think it's something new. And the second question, the second thing that I wanted to mention, that I agree fully about the leadership that we need for gender, and that we need to deconstruct social norms that we have right now. But for example, analyzing the European Commission proposal for the next MFF, and especially when it comes to global policies that we are going to have, it seems that the ambition of the EU, which is lowering. So the big question for civil society, but also for members of the European Parliament, for example, is what is the entry point for advocating actually the standard for gender equality being higher than it used to be, while we see that the political will is not there anymore. Thank you.
We take a few questions, if there are any more.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed the panel, and it's great to have also many men discussing this topic with us. It's not always the case. I wanted to ask a bit more about the EU as well. From your experience and expertise, how do you feel, or how do you perceive other countries, developing countries or partner countries negotiating trade agreements with the EU, perceive the EU's standards and willingness to negotiate provisions on trade? Because in theory, for instance, the EU Gender Action Plan says that the EU needs to consider trade chapters, gender chapters in all its trade agreements. So I wanted to hear from you how other countries partnering with the EU are usually see this. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the invitation, the event, and the panel. It's been very interesting. I'm really sorry that I'm not only going to ask a question, but I would like to start by sharing with you a little bit of the Chilean experience. I'm Trini Saon. I work at the Mission of Chile to the EU, and I'm very proud to say that we have sort of a long-standing experience in gender and trade. The first trade agreement we negotiated, which included a chapter, was with Uruguay in 2016, and it was finalized in 2018. We recently have modernized our association framework agreement with the EU. The first agreement was from 2002. Now we have included several disciplines that were not included in 2002, and the association framework agreement that entered into provisional force last June has dedicated chapter on gender and trade, and has included I always forget the name as well, but it's a non-derogation clause. So I'm very proud that it's a state policy that has survived many different governments from very different political views, because our state view is that to have an inclusive economic growth, we do have to include the gender perspective. And under the current government, we have designed, and we are implementing feminist foreign policy, which has reinforced this already implemented policy. And alongside bilateral trade agreements, we have very active participation in different fora that deals with gender and trade at the WTO, among others, the Pacific Alliance, APEC, many others. So we are really trying, and from our experience, it's not only about, as you said, negotiating, but also about creating awareness within different constituencies of why these disciplines are important to uplift women, and not only in terms of work, but also in terms of economic empowerment at the higher levels. And it's been a work that has been carried out throughout the years. Last year, we almost reached a rate of 30% of women-led companies that are exporting, which is a very good quota, not a fantastic one, but I think it is exceptional nonetheless. So I could continue, but the main basis is there. What I would say, and I would love the panel to delve a bit deeper on, it's something related to services and economic transformation. We are already living, because we already know it's not only a gap within green jobs, but the digital transformation is also a very big challenge that we face in terms of women's economic empowerment, and how we are going to move faster in involving women in trade, because we know that digital services are mainly that have a very big global and international component. So I would love to hear more about that. Thank you very much again.
I'm going to leave it to the panel discussion on who wants to take which question, because some of them are biased towards Belen, I think.
Yes.
But if any of you want to weigh in as well, please do. So Belen, over to you.
You hear me correctly? Yeah, good. Thank you very much. Very, very interesting questions. I will go in order if it is okay. So first, regarding the issue of trust that I mentioned and you pointed out, very good, because you give me the chance to explain a little better what I meant. So there's an interesting study that a colleague of mine at Maastricht University, the Faculty of Policy, has carried out. Clara Weinhardt, you can take that out. I can send you the link later. That actually shows how sometimes in the context of, for example, of the WTO. Although there is supportive membership to, as you pointed out correctly, to continue the work of the working group and on this issue, it's only about cooperation, right? And not really provisions that can have a broader effect, or let's say that it will address deeper needs and differences or issues that affect women in trade. And in that sense, that's why I said sometimes it's an issue of trust, especially in the multilateral environment, trust because developing countries feel that there are issues that were important to them that were not addressed in the Doha rounds, for example, when we talk about trade and trade in agriculture. And that there are issues now that are related to trade and sustainability, which includes issues of gender inclusion, that are being, and I quote, imposed on them, and the issues that really interested, that are really behind their interests are not really negotiated under the framework, for example, of the WTO. And I think that's exacerbated in the context of bilateral negotiations when you have trade partners that go ahead and impose unilateral measures that without really taking into account how they're going to affect their trade partners. And this, basically creates more distrust. And unfortunately, and why do I point out to the issue of trust? Because you can see how this directly impacts the type of provisions that are later on included in the trade agreements. So, for example, if you take a look at certain provisions included in trade agreements between the EU and developing countries, most of the trade and gender provisions are best effort clauses and clauses regarding cooperation. But they're not really, as Simonetta pointed out, they are not really mandatory provisions, and they're not really subjected to the enforcement mechanisms of the agreement. So this is another issue, because if we are going to have binding provisions, what is actually the effect of those binding provisions if we cannot really take the non-compliance or the possible non-compliance with this, of those provisions to the enforcement mechanism of the agreement? So there you have another issue, and I think it could be interested if the colleague from Chile can share more, because I think it's a wonderful and I was very happy to see that in the modified agreement with the EU, there is now a gender chapter and a non-derogation clause, but I'm not quite sure if it is still subject to the enforcement mechanism of the agreement or not. I think it's the latter, unfortunately. That's for example, to my understanding, that will be something to look forward to, how this type of provisions can and are going to be included in the enforcement mechanisms. And very quickly, continue on the impact of trade partners, because then I think that I can give the floor also to my colleagues. I think more or less I already pointed to this, but how trade partners perceive EU standards, right? In relation to trade and gender. Perhaps I can tell you a little bit about my experience when I was negotiating, because let's address the elephant in the room, which is that the EU-Mercosur trade agreement does not include any provision on trade and gender, right? And does not include a chapter also. There's only a brief mention on the TSD chapter about labor rights that refers to equality in the labor market, but does not really include specific provisions or specific chapters. Does that not mean that the issue of trade and gender was not considered by the negotiators, or both from both sides, from the EU side and from the Mercosur side, are taken into account when addressing certain concessions that were going to be made in the context of the agreement? Of course, it was considered, and the work group consulted in that regard. If you ask me, it could have been better. Yeah, probably could have been better, and we could have had a specific chapter, or at least a specific section in the TSD chapter of the agreement, and of course in the preamble of the agreement, because including this type of issues in the preamble of the agreement allows you, although the preamble is not binding per se, but it allows you then from a legal perspective, and I'm not going to bore you with the technicalities, but to take it into account when interpreting an agreement later on. And then you can actually say, well, this is part of the object and purpose of the agreement, to not only promote trade among the partners, but to promote inclusive trade among the partners, which is very different. But yeah, unfortunately, this was not the case. It was a procedural problem, because the mandate of the agreement was already done by then when the negotiations restarted, and the Commission did not have the opportunity to actually, let's say, ask for a new mandate to include a trade and gender chapter. But still, I think there are many things that you can see and analyze in the agreement through the lens of a gender or a trade and inclusion perspective, either way. That will be informed also from the political and cooperation part of the agreement. But I could say, at least from my experience and in South American region, that the standards in relation to trade and gender, up until I was involved at least, were not concerned in the negative sense. To the contrary, like the countries were very much interested in promoting cooperation among the blocs to actually address the issue of trade and gender. Unfortunately, I'm not sure if I can say that this is still the case nowadays, because of issues that we all see are happening in some countries, and especially in Argentina right now. But still, it is very important that these issues then are linked to a trade agreement that may soon enter into force, because then it will give the institutional and regulatory stability, which I think is one of the main goals of having a trade agreement that includes this type of issues, and that can, through the trade agreement, promote a better regulatory environment in the country. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, maybe also to Aline's question, and I think it's somewhat related with Julia's question as well, on essentially these unilateral normative measures that are being imposed on developing economies. Because I think there is a problem here, and that somewhat justifies the lack of trust or the issues that developing economies see with this. And I think partly it starts where an idea is put into this political process within the advanced economies, because then often the regulation that comes out of it is not, super tightly linked to the idea that was originally put into it. And I mean, that is related to labor standards when we think of due diligence regulations, but it's also very visible in some of the green measures such on deforestation or so on, that impose massive compliance costs on small scale producers in developing economies, but do not address at all the context in which this happens. Because what we sometimes think is very strange is that there seems to be the underlying idea that developing economies would find some weird joy in exploiting the workforce locally, right? Like that they do this willingly. But what we don't look at is that in almost all sectors, we have a huge market power issue, where we have a few large companies in advanced economies, in textile with Zara or Inditex and H&M, but it's everywhere in chemicals with BASF, and we have in pharma with Merck and Pfizer. Often we have in mining, it's a huge issue with Rio Tinto. So often we have in the advanced economies that are companies that can set the prices, and the developing companies need to deliver at this price, right? It's not that they willingly provide low wages and bad services to the workforce. And these companies are subject to the regulatory authority of the advanced economies, but this is often not addressed enough, or at least their market power is not being addressed, right? Imposing some kind of transparency regulations can go only so far if the underlying market power issues are not addressed here. And I think that is something that then is being justified to be pointed out, because I think these measures only work if they go hand in hand with support that would enable the firms in developing economies to comply with the regulations. And there's a very nice study in Costa Rica that found exactly that when firms started to roll out corporate social responsibility measures, that essentially the firms in Costa Rica had to drop out of the exporting or supplying these multinationals, because the multinationals imposed the rules, but they did not increase the prices that we're going to offer for the inputs. So what happens is that they source the inputs from elsewhere, and that's exactly what the developing economies then perceive as hidden protectionism. And I think that's like, it's difficult because we're still at the start of this, because the underlying issues are of course justified, and it's good to try to address it, but I think we need to work harder and don't just essentially outsource the regulations to developing economies, but address the issues everywhere and provide the support that is needed. And I think one positive example is, for instance, the rapid response mechanism in USMCA, because the US said you can bring these complaints, and it's the US that's going to cover all the expenses related to the complaints, right? The investigations. Because once again, if you give a developing economy the right to investigate complaints, but not the resources to them, enforcement is not just about legal enforcement, it's also about the resources that are required to enforce the agreements. So that's just a point I wanted to make.
Any inputs, Cornelio or Simonetta online? Hello?
Yeah.
Yes. Did you want to make any inputs?
Thank you. Yes.
Quick 1 minute, please. Sorry.
Yeah.
We're
I
running out
would
of
like
time.
to pick up on the question on if I have well understood how to go a bit deeper and not to stay kind of the surface of issues, and or the solution that may look like kind of not very that cannot make really a difference. And I think going back to the trade agreements and the FTAs, one instrument that seems to me to allow to go beyond this, we will cooperate, we will share data, we will do our best in a very vague language, is to do a very serious ex-ante impact assessment of the agreement. Because then you really see what will be the implications of the agreement on different segments of the population. So you can see what will happen, what will likely, the likely impact on women, on, I don't know, on rural population, on indigenous population. So then you move from this idea that an agreement can be good for a country, and maybe it is, to see, okay, it is good for the country as a whole, but a country is made of different groups. of the population, and might be something, especially in the short term, may suffer, and they need to be supported. And Canada seems to me the country that really is doing this ex-ante impact assessment very thoroughly, and perhaps other countries could follow this example. The EU is doing it, but sometimes when the impact assessment, the sustainability impact assessment comes, that include a gender component, then the negotiations are already over, and the negotiators who may have been negotiating for years and years are not willing or able to reopen the negotiations to take into account what the results of the impact assessment. So to me, this is it could be a really good instrument to move from the goodwill clauses to something really that gives a good picture. If this agreement enters into force, what does it mean? And the last point on Chile, I would like to congratulate Chile. In Geneva, we have been working very closely with the mission of Chile to the WTO and to the UN, and always we have found a lot of support and interest for trade and gender. And as was rightly pointed out, all the first agreements that included the gender chapters were all negotiated from countries in South America. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I don't think anything to add. I think it has been captured very well by my colleagues in the panel. But since it's the end, and you mentioned the pink tax, I wanted to refer to that one actually, if I can just very quickly. So under the economics program, there is a network of global feminist economists, right? Like promoting different or helping the economists, reshaping or relooking at the economies. So one of the things around the pink taxes that they say is that we should be careful with those because, well, for one, it addresses women as a uniform population and not the different, to your point, Belen, of different groups. There is no intersectionality in that one. So, we might end up actually those women who didn't afford to buy those products anyways, that the tax didn't have any effect on them because the product was not purchased before, it's not purchased now, so it didn't influence in any ways. That's for one. So they argue that some targeted direct support programs would be, in certain instances better. They would also argue that sometimes, in the absence of any other measures and maybe controls, the companies, the private sector companies, might increase the price because they would see an opportunity there, right? You have less taxes. But the market was already used to that one, so why don't we actually increase our portion, right? So in time, right? It's not happening right now. So there were a few cases like that they've studied. So there are some studies around this, including when the authorities said, "Oh wow, okay, it didn't work. Let's go backwards. Let's increase it back." So when they increase it back, actually the company says, "Oh, you see, now we have to add it again." So I think while this is a good thing, I think it needs to be thought thoroughly. In combination with some other measures, and to see whether or not other measures might be, in certain instances, actually working better than that. I just wanted to add that one because,
No, I'm glad you did because I have an example for you of that exact same thing. In Zambia, if I remember correctly, they had a tampon tax. As you all know, tampon tax is the extra tax that is put on menstrual items that are used by women, and they removed the tampon tax, thinking that this is a good measure. So let's do it. Unfortunately, the moment they removed the tampon tax, the retailers increased the price to capture that margin that they were not capturing earlier. And basically the female consumers didn't even know that the tax has been reduced. There was no awareness. And second, basically this meant higher profits for retailers. So the government had to reintroduce a tampon tax because of that. So you're absolutely right.
Did it go up even further than after that?
I didn't follow that. I didn't follow that, the trajectory, but yeah, they had to reintroduce it. So I think this brings us to a very important point that's been raised again and again through this conversation, and to close the session as well, that I think raising awareness and having the right leadership to make sure these measures, the inclusive measures actually work, I think has become very, very important. Because trade disruptions will continue to happen and they will impact women disproportionately or make them worse off from where they are. But I think we are also trying to move in a positive direction, that we must look beyond one, for example, beyond manufacturing, look towards services sector, where it might be able to cushion the impact that women are facing in the manufacturing sector. Also moving forward, as very rightly pointed out through research, that if we don't make any changes today, it's going to get worse. So there is an immediate need to make more and more investment in bridging this gap in all different spheres, especially taking into account the whole intersectionality issue that we have, that has been highlighted again and again, that that itself means that women across these different intersections are impacted more. And of course, very aptly pointed out, an ex-ante assessment is something that countries should be doing. I know many countries do, but sometimes it ends up being a tick mark rather than actual assessment that, oh yeah, we've done it, let's move ahead. But nothing really comes out of it. So I think it's important to go beyond using soft language for gender inclusion and gender equality, and coming up with measures that actually work. Not just like a simple chapter, for example, in a trade agreement, or simple use of language, but moving beyond that to something that is workable, that we have seen works in the past, and something that actually recognizes that women occupy very different roles within trade, within a society, and they are going to be impacted very differently. So those considerations must be taken into account. And one shameless moment of self-promotion, if you want to follow some of the work that the ODI family, both ODI Global and ODI Europe, has been doing on trade and gender, my colleague Yusuf will quickly put on a QR code on the screen. So if you scan that QR code, it's going to lead you to the ODI webpage on trade and gender. And you can follow along with how we discover and sort of understand this space much better. And this particular panel has been an excellent addition to that conversation that we've been having internally, but now also externally. So thank you very much for your time, everybody. A huge round of applause for the panel who have sorry, who have been, yeah, I mean, you spared your afternoon, and afternoon, I know everyone falls asleep. So thank you very much for keeping it interesting today.
Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you to UN Women for the great collaboration, and to the wonderful panel and our lovely moderator for that fantastic discussion, which was great. I just want to invite everybody to check out our latest work, including a research report on the Gap 3 to Gap 4, Rethinking the EU's Support for Gender Equality by my colleague Aline. Do have a look, we've just published it. And also the toolkit, which was published earlier this year to help donors strengthen their due diligence processes in light of rising anti-gender actors. So do have a look at those. Our next gender talk will be in early December on the topic of digital governance, AI and gender. And if you're not on our mailing list, do let us know and we will add you to it. Once again, a big thank you. Thank you to those who joined online, and for those in the room, you're very welcome to join us outside for some refreshments. Thank you again.